Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is James Lindsay. Subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. So just yesterday, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy huddled with Republicans on Capitol Hill to start fleshing out what their Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, will look like. The pair have already said DOGE will seek to slash the federal government, in some cases targeting, quote, progressive beneficiaries of taxpayer money like Planned Parenthood. Ramaswamy famously wrote an entire book called Woke Inc. about, quote, corporate America's social justice scam. But as Chris Rufo points out in his own outline for a second Trump administration, diversity and inclusion has become a multi-billion-dollar industry and a key mechanism for advancing left-wing ideologies in corporations, schools, government agencies, and, quote, an executive order would limit these initiatives, scope, and growth while creating legal risks for firms engaging in discriminatory and or extremist practices. So that's just to say the government and the corporations are kind of in the business together. So as conservatives prepare to take on the woke left, does the Republican Party have a problem with the woke right? James Lindsay thinks so, and he set out to prove it with a major experiment this week. Lindsay famously rocked academia in 2018 by sneaking satirical papers into prestigious journals to undermine the legitimacy of left-wing institutions. It was hilarious, and he just did something similar with a conservative Protestant website called The American Reformer this week, convincing the outlet to publish a piece on November 18th headlined The Liberal Consensus and the New Christian Right, under the very subtle pseudonym Marcus Carlson. Carlson's article was actually, as Lindsay put it, quote, the preamble and then just short of 6 continuous pages of text from the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto, in which Lindsay, quote, rather crudely swapped out references to the bourgeoisie with something to do with either liberalism, liberals, classical liberalism, or their real and mighty bugbear that they call the post-war liberal consensus, which they believe oppresses them, and swapped out references to the proletariat with references to an object they, that's the woke right, call the New Christian Right, as a way of referring to themselves. Those were Lindsay's words. And he says, quote, then he massaged some of the specifics for fit, flourish, and flow, cut a bunch and consolidated to fit the word count requirement, then submitted the piece from a burner account. The result was paragraphs like this one, and I'm quoting here. In its precious world market, its bright golden calf, liberalism, however classical, sells the lie of free trade, but what it trades are peoples and their organic communities for its own bloody profits. In one word, liberalism is betrayal. Veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted for life a naked, shameless, direct, brutal betrayal of everything and everyone who made its rise possible in the first place. The American Reformer, which published those words, responded by adding an update to the November 18th article after Lindsay outed it this week that read, this was intended as a hoax, but it's seemingly poorly conceived, given the undeniable power of Marx's rhetorical approach, as Lindsay himself acknowledged. While we were unaware of its authorship and motive, it is still a reasonable aggregation of some new right ideas repackaged into Marx's effective rhetoric, and we've corrected its authorship to properly credit Mr. Lindsay. Now, some people on the right criticized Lindsay's whole operation. Mike Cernovich said, quote, James significantly rewrote the original passages while claiming he submitted them materially unaltered. Incredibly dishonest representation of what he did. He added, quote, many critical theorists, Herbert Marcuse comes to mind, had insight into how capitalism created fake needs via the advertising industry. It's stupid to dismiss their work outright. Lindsay himself posted a side-by-side comparison to his own website. And Cernovich has criticized proponents of the woke right theory before, making a point about the term just this week on Michael Malice's show.
What do you think of this term I see bubbling around on social media, woke right? And whether there's something to it?
Right when you said the term bubbling around social media, that's another instance of former leftists who have decided that their job is to police the right, but to police the fringe of the fringe right to the degree that I don't even know the people they're talking about.
Responses to the hoax from Cernovich and the American Reformer offer a pretty interesting insight, arguing that critical theorists and even Marx himself actually relied on trenchant observations about capitalism and culture. Why does any of this matter? Well, I would say it matters because this is an internecine battle on the new right, and the new right is preparing to take over the American government. J.D. Vance and his ideological brethren are sharp critics of liberalism and are working actively right now, at this very moment, literally blocks away from where I'm recording this, to reshape the Republican Party into a force that will address the problems of the liberal order as they understand them. And I personally, by the way, am fairly sympathetic to that. This is really important right now because what we've taken for granted since the end of World War II, including increasingly freer and freer markets, more and more globalism, and the spread of all of this in the name of democracy, is absolutely facing a threat. That order is absolutely facing a threat. You may find this terrifying, you may find this exhilarating, but it's happening. So let's talk to James Lindsay himself, author and founder of New Discourses. James, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, glad to be here.
This episode is sponsored by Lumen. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. And on the app, it actually lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, your workouts, your sleep, and even stress management. All you have to do, it's so easy, is breathe right into your Lumen first thing in the morning, and you'll know what's going on with your metabolism. Lumen will tell you if you are burning mostly fats or carbs. Then Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. It's so amazing. You can also breathe into it before and after workouts and meals so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time. Again, that is incredible. And Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. It can also track your cycle as well as the onset of menopause and adjust your recommendations to keep your metabolism healthy through hormonal shifts so you can keep up your energy and stave off those cravings. So if you want to take the next step in improving your health, go to lumen.me/undercurrents to get 15% off Lumen. Great deal. That is lumen.me/undercurrents for 15% off your purchase. Now, I want to start with something really interesting. You swapped Marx's critical mentions of bourgeoisie with liberalism in your modifications to the Communist Manifesto. I think that's really interesting, and it opens up this question of who we should think of as members of the quote-unquote woke right, and why do they sort of fall into that category?
Yeah, I think this is a interesting topic because it's new. It's terminologically confusing. It's very clear that the word woke is associated with left, and then right is associated with the right. People tend to see these things in like tribal teams. So that's mixing us and them into a single phrase. That's extremely confusing for a lot of people. So I think it's an important discussion, and I'll preface by saying I don't know if this is the best term. I've said that. Konstantin Kitsin and I talked about it on Trigonometry the other day, and he insisted that it is, and I gave way to that. I don't disagree. It seems to irritate them. I take these terms very literally. I mean, I've studied the woke left phenomenon, the woke Marxist phenomenon now for a decade, and very intensely for at least 6 or 7 years. And when I say woke, I mean something very specific. I'm not being glib to call it woke right. I mean that woke means that you've awoken to a oppressor-oppressed dynamic as the basis for how society is organized. In other words, that the fundamental organizing principle of society is some form of oppression of usually people like me, and that you have a duty of conscience to resist that oppression through collective action, aiming to seize power, as a matter of fact, for your faction. And that's rooted in the first paragraph of the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto, where Marx says that all of history is the history of class antagonism or class conflict, which is now called conflict theory, and that the movement of history is defined by those conflicts, and that those conflicts can be summarized. Sometimes it's this and that and the other thing, but he says it can be summarized in a single word, which he says is oppressor versus oppressed. And so believing that about the world makes you woke. I don't necessarily think that it matters what you think that grand conspiracy theory and structural power dynamic is. As I kind of became famous for was I said, look, Marxism does this with economics, but critical race theory does it with race, and queer theory does it with sexuality, and feminism frequently does it with sex. You can interchange the parts, but still have the same, if we're technical, dialectical logic or conflict theory driven logic at the heart of it. And I have argued, I think persuasively, that that's what characterizes Marxism as Marxism, or woke as woke, if we update into contemporary slang. And so if you decide to insert a grand conspiracy theory about the true right being excluded from contemporary politics because of a coordinated effort to box out their beliefs. And those beliefs are very frequently either fascist or neo-fascist of some stripe or another, or touching into that. Or on the other hand, sometimes they're very theocratic, almost religious fascist. If you say that there's a coordinated effort by the mainstream to exclude people like you, that targets people like you, and that you have now become, by awakening to this understanding of reality, the only true bearers of the correct understanding of the world and the solutions to the problems that we face, then you're probably woke, even though you're on the right. You're just being woke in service to right-wing beliefs or values.
So who are some of the thinkers you think fall most notably into that category? I mean, would you put somebody like J.D. Vance, a post-liberal or critic of liberalism, into that category?
The short answer is yes, sort of, but not completely. The reason this is hard to answer, and I'm not being evasive here, the reason that this is hard to answer is because what I've called, or am calling, for lack of a better term, and I stress that again, the woke right is it's still in very many factions that don't agree with one another on some very fundamental things. And so on the one hand, you have, these kind of very edgy, Jew-hating, women-hating, homosexual-hating people called the Groypers that are, blatantly thinking there's some huge conspiracy that the Jews control everything and Jewish power is the thing, and it's all anti-Semitism in the name of some, all-powerful traditional Catholic, something that's supposed to rise up if you listen to Nick Fuentes. And somebody like him obviously doesn't share a ton of beliefs in common with somebody like J.D. Vance, who is post-liberal. But the post-liberalism is itself one of these indicators. So if you had like a checklist of things that made somebody likely to be diagnosable as having woke right ideas, I was going to use the term I usually use, which is ideological contamination by woke right ideas. The post-liberal is a checkbox. It doesn't make you that, but it's a checkbox. It's something you've got to be looking at. If you've become skeptical of the broad liberal order, it depends as to what makes you woke or not woke. What makes you woke or not woke is whether or not you've woken up to a structural oppression-based system that governs society. So has J.D. Vance done that? I don't notice that. I don't think so, but he is post-liberal. So that's just kind of like one, it's not even woke right adjacent necessarily. It's like one checkbox among many. On the other hand, you have these people like an American Reformer who received my rewrite of the Communist Manifesto and published it, and they don't agree with this anti-Semitism coming from the Groypers, although they do have some other hardline views about women and homosexuals that do have some alignment. I don't know where they stand. They seem not to be skeptical, actually, of Israel. I don't know where they stand on that for sure, but they are broadly skeptical of something they call the post-war liberal consensus. And the point of the post-war liberal consensus, the war being World War II, was that we're not going to do fascism anymore. We're not going to have another Hitler. And the creation of Israel was actually supposed to be part of that program, to give the Jews a place where they could be in a single state with good defense. And why not put it in their indigenous homeland? Was at least part of this so-called liberal consensus that they're extremely skeptical of. So I don't think J.D. Vance is necessarily woke right, but I am concerned about his post-liberalism. And post-liberalism, has other factions that are not necessarily so woke. But when we get metaphysical about it, very frequently there are deep undercurrents. I mean, I don't know how weedy you want my answer, but a lot of post-liberalism, probably J.D. Vance's, is based off of Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss was Heideggerian. Heidegger was deep in the veins of these kind of woke, kind of Gnostic theories about how the world works. We've been flung into a world outside of our own choosing, and it's this kind of prison that we're all in. And so now we're going to explore what it means to be in such a world. And that's a very Gnostic kind of belief system. So waking up to the true reality, is kind of downstream from that. How deeply Heideggerian J.D. Vance is, I don't know. I don't suspect very much. But Leo Strauss was very Heideggerian. And so, ideological contamination is a good way to describe the phenomenon of having picked up some, but not all, of a militant ideology.
I think that speaks specifically to the utility of Marx in the context of the American Reformer as well. And their response, you obviously wrote about this as well, is really interesting. They say, well, we were unaware of its authorship and motive. It is still a reasonable aggregation of some new right ideas repackaged into Marx's effective rhetoric. And when Mike Cernovich was criticizing you, he also mentioned there were critical theorists like Marcuse, I think is who he cited, that were sort of onto something about capitalism. And I find that really interesting, James, because you point out that's sort of a concession of the point that you were making, but Marx is writing in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. These folks talk about the post-war liberal consensus, post-war being the technology of like nuclear weapons, creating a legitimately new world order, to use that in a very literal sense, as opposed to a conspiratorial, pejorative one. What role do you think those two kind of historical hinge points play in how Marx is looking at the world, and why conservatives now are embracing potentially that Marxist dialectic, as you say?
I've been shocked by this response. We were, of course, I told my team at New Discourses where I work that I had done this on something like Thursday of last week, and so we discussed it over the weekend. We released it on Tuesday of this week. So there's 5 or 6 days in between when we were discussing it. We're trying to figure out what's going to happen. And we had guessed that they're probably going to do some kind of, people would start to say, well, Marx wasn't all wrong. He had some good points. I had no idea that that was going to become their primary mode of defending themselves, is that Marx was way more right than people think. His critiques of classical liberalism were really spot on. Marx didn't give a lot of very clear critiques of liberalism. He did some, but he primarily critiqued capitalism, which is the economic engine associated with classical liberalism. And his critiques, though, are not good faith. So we have to put on the table first before we can compare these things, because I do think there is a comparison to be made here. But we have to put on the table that Marx's critiques are not good faith at all. He was not making a good faith critique of capitalism or a good faith critique of liberalism more broadly. He was making a critique that was serviced to trying to agitate to get a revolution, to get a socialist world order. His critique of liberalism or capitalism was, in fact, that the means of exploitation from feudalism into the capitalist phase had changed, and that created certain problems and externalities that he used as agitprop to agitate the people who had enjoyed or had a better circumstance in some ways under the feudal arrangement than they were receiving under industrial capitalism. But his problem was that actually the intrinsic class relation, the class conflict that defines history, that fight actually just got harder. And so now you've concentrated the wealth not in these royalty and all of the, the nobility, but now you've concentrated wealth in the hands of these exploitative capitalists who are the masters of the factories, and that they're extraordinarily exploitative. But because everybody has their own property rights, you now have this situation where people can't understand why this is so bad. People start to believe that they can, have a bit of their own, and maybe they can become the big factory owner themselves. And so Marx was not critiquing liberalism and the externalities that the switch from feudalism to capitalism produced, because he thought that feudalism was some ideal state. That was another class society with its intrinsic class conflicts. That was not socialism. And so Marx's goal was to agitate to get a revolution for socialism. So we've got to start there, unfortunately, which is a lot to unpack before we start talking about this comparison. But yeah, Marx was a reactionary, just like the guys at the American Reformers are reactionaries. I've done a number of long threads. I haven't really talked about it too much elsewhere, but I've done a number of long threads on X talking about how Marxism is as they call it, a return movement. Marx is looking back to the tribal time. This is like old school European philosophy, state of nature stuff. He's looking back to the tribal time when we had total communal tribes, and he's like, that's how human beings are supposed to live. We're supposed to be one giant family with no sense of exclusive ownership from one person to another that shares everything, but the tribes shouldn't be estranged from one another. We need to do a dialectical process to make the tribe global. The entire planet
man
becomes
is born
one tribe.
free, but everywhere he is in change.
That's right. Drawing inspiration from Rousseau, obviously. So this is like another state of nature. So what Marx is doing is the way that these philosophies like Marxism work, these progressive philosophies, is they look back to some idealized picture of the past and then project a dialectical expansion of that into the future and then say that's their inspiration. So now we're going to have a global commune. But the fact is, he's still looking back to man's state of nature as the ideal. And his goal is to square the circle, because what he wants to do is he wants to take the ideal state of nature, of man in his tribal commune, which is literally an extended family that shares everything, and figure out how to get all the benefits of capitalism and all the benefits of, an advanced economy and spread that out among everybody all at once. So we're going to have the best of both worlds, which was also Rousseau's project. How do we have the benefits of civilization while we have the freedom of the savage, is the way that Rousseau was exploring it. This is a very popular current. So he's a reactionary looking at the Industrial Revolution and saying, in fact, while this looks like things got better, it's actually taken us further away from the thing we want to be. However, history moves this way. This is kind of the cunning of history, or the cunning of reason from Hegel being adopted. History moves this way because what actually is happening with capitalism is that it's socializing the means of production into very few hands. So all we have to do is overthrow those factory owners and then convince the population that that was the right thing to do, and we will already have socialist organization for the production of society. And here we have these reactionaries that are looking. You're right. The introduction of the atomic bomb, now the introduction of mass surveillance technology, the internet and social media and so on. And there's a reaction. Before we had all this, things were better. Blah 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 blah. And in fact, even before the Industrial Revolution, things were better. They're agreeing with Marx. Marx had the correct analyses. I think they're missing. They say that the Marxist critique is that capitalism and liberalism brought us to a place where individuals were atomizing. They were moving apart from each other. They broke the traditional social bonds. That's actually the argument that they're giving. But as far as I can tell, and I'm not, I'm an expert in their ideology. I'm not an expert in this aspect of history, but from what I can tell, every time people get more money, they buy more privacy with it. They buy a big house with a fence around it. The American dream is supposed to be a house with a white picket fence, right? What's the fence? The fence is to keep the neighbors out, right? And you want a bigger yard that the neighbors are further apart. And so I have a feeling that the fruit that has dissolved many of the social bonds that they're hearkening back to, romanticizing, is actually that people became more wealthy. And so they're doing a Marxist kind of, or Hegelian or Rousseauian squaring of the circle. How do we get the social bonds of a deeply impoverished society that has to be deeply horizontally integrated to survive winters, while we get to maintain having iPhones and a comfortable man cave downstairs where I get to watch the game with my boys?
Yeah, and there's this sort of interesting middle of the Venn diagram between Marxists and Catholics and traditional Christians who love the Shire, revere the Shire, sort of see the Shire as the ideal. What's interesting about that is it is the oppressor-oppressed dynamic, right? That the oppressor-oppressed dynamic is perhaps the most comfortable, acceptable response to a shrinking globe. And I wonder if you think that's true, that when that the sort of reaction to the Industrial Revolution shrinking the globe, leading to things like industrial slavery, for example, like actual chattel slavery around the globe, something that Marx and Marxists have been very concerned about. And then on the other hand, you have, high tech shrinking the globe to the point where C.S. Lewis and Tolkien are reacting in the 20th century. Is it sort of that it's comfortable to see this as a Manichaean struggle when the globe is shrinking further and further because of technology?
I think that that's probably right. It's certainly how they see the world is as a Manichaean struggle. The oppressor is all bad and the oppressed is all good. And there's an intrinsic conflict between good and evil that defines, basically your spiritual state. They call it being on the right side of history. But I think, like I said, Marxism was a return movement, but dialectical in the sense that it was going to combine moving forward with moving backwards, which is, of course, nonsense and doesn't work. It doesn't acknowledge that there are trade-offs to everything that develops. And I do think there is this, I black pill when I think about, brain chips and all this drone technology. And I'm like, oh my God, I don't want to live in this future. And I can understand that you see that possibility and you think to yourself, what if we could just, go back? But then you start trying to figure it out. How do we keep the good of what we've come so far with? And yeah, I think that it could actually be something like what you've just characterized.
One of the big questions, I think, as I've been, sort of considering the article, giving something a name like woke right doesn't necessarily make it wrong. So I'm curious, James, where you think, is it that sort of simplicity that papers over perhaps the nuance? If you're looking at everything as Manichaean and as a oppressor-oppressed dynamic, is it possible that there's something right about that, to the point you just made about brain chips? Like, how do you think about what's actually incorrect or fundamentally flawed about a worldview? And I mean that in a neutral sense, whether it's a worldview that's Marxist or Christian, taking the oppressor dynamic on a macro scale. Is there something fundamentally wrong about that? Is it wrong as a category?
The oppressor-oppressed dynamic, I don't think, is a healthy way to view life. To see everything through conflict theory, as a matter of fact, which is something the woke right is very wont to do. One of their other, favorite philosophers over there at American Reformer and further into the so-called woke right is Carl Schmitt. And Carl Schmitt was labeled later the crown jurist of the Third Reich, but he was rather famous before the Nazis came to power for trying to stop the Nazis from coming to power, and also to stop the communists from taking power in Germany. And he wrote a book called The Concept of the Political the year before Hitler took the chancellery. Then he became a Nazi immediately and never renounced it. That's another story. But this book, The Concept of the Political, says that the essential concept that defines the political realm is the conflict between friend and enemy, what he called the friend-enemy distinction. And this is actually how they think about politics. And I think that that's an element of politics. In fact, I think it's the element that you land at when everything else falls through, but it's also therefore the state you work very hard to try to avoid. And I see Schmitt's point that you can't get away from it all the way. You can't live in this naive world where that conflict is not at some point underneath and waiting. And in that regard, I see him as, a somewhat subtle thinker on this issue. I've been criticized and praised for calling him a subtle thinker, so I don't know what to do with that. But they've adopted Schmitt, and they have this fundamental conflict-oriented worldview. And I think when the old saying is, when all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail. When you have a worldview that the world that you inhabit is fundamentally characterized by a Manichaean struggle with a true conflict between good and evil, us versus them, friend versus foe, then you look for conflict. You generate conflict. And then, of course, your people can't be the wrong people. You can't be the bad guys because you're the friends. You can't be the bad guys. Friends is, of course, one of the Groyper words. Hey, friend. And so, friend spelled F-R-E-N. And so, at that point, what are you going to do? You're going to externalize the blame. It's somehow you were sabotaged by the enemy. It wasn't that and you get all of the kind of dynamics that made both communist and fascist regimes turn into hellholes. And so I'm very concerned about adopting that kind of a view. And I'm actually really impressed with the organization of Christianity, because to the degree that Christianity adopts such a view in its essential theology, the oppressed is ironically God. It's Christ, right? So Christ is oppressed, and every man, because of his intrinsic original sin, is the oppressor. And so now you have like this kind of removal of the political dynamic that can be generated, while also offering a channeling into learning deep spiritual truths that are very clearly very pro-social through the kind of impulse to see things that way. So, that's why the Christians frequently say, we are the ones who killed Christ. Although the woke right says the Jews are the ones who killed Christ. And they're very specific about that because, again, it can't be us who's the bad guy. It has to be somebody else who's the bad guy. And it has to be our class enemy who's the bad guy, being the essential logic. So I'm very concerned about the adoption of the oppressor versus oppressed dynamic and the friend-enemy distinction as a essential lens through which you view the entire world. Yeah, definitely concerned about that.
I think if I were a fusionist Catholic, like a Buckley type, I would right now say, what Karl Marx and some of these other guys have in common, American Reformer, in fact, have in common, and that's Protestantism, sort of baking in the Protestant climate. Tom Holland might also make that argument and sort of extend that Protestant line to wokeness, I guess. I don't know. I mean, is there something about Protestant Germany at the time that Marx is writing and the American Reformer now that's incubating maybe a reaction like that?
I feel like the American reformer woke right of today is making the same errors that the fascists in Europe made a century ago, rather explicitly in the response to the genuinely existential threat of a Marxist takeover. But
like a
as
Franco,
for
like a Catholic
yeah,
reaction.
Franco would be an example. Hitler is an example. Mussolini had, as one of his pillars of fascism, was anti-Marxism. But on the other hand, Hitler said that he was going to be the executor of Marxism, that Marxism had all this extraneous stuff that it didn't need, so he got rid of it, and he was going to actually make it work. And that's why he called themselves National Socialists. So that's a different context in the American reformer question. But for Marx, was there something going on in Germany that led to this? Yes, there was, which was a rampant current of mysticism and mystical secret societies that, and you say German Protestantism, specifically, of course, everybody knows that Marx studied both Feuerbach, but also he studied Hegel. And Hegel was not just a student, but at some points employed at the Tübingen Stift. The Stift was a Lutheran seminary, very famously in that region of Germany, in Swabia. That seminary was basically a front operation for lots of Christian mysticism posing as Lutheran theology. So there was a deep undercurrent of all of these Gnostic and Hermetic beliefs. And some of these were drawn, more and less genuinely from, readings of both Christian and Jewish Kabbalah. Some of these were drawn directly from things like Corpus Hermeticum. Some of them were drawn from the alchemical tradition. Some of them were drawn directly from the Gnostics, the heretical Gospels, and the Gnostics and in the Jewish mystic tradition before that. And this mystical stew was what Hegel was actually reconfiguring in his philosophy, his dialectic, which became the basis for Marx's dialectical materialism. And, Marx very likely did just create a mystical heresy of Lutheranism, probably in angry rejection of his father, who was a Lutheran that they had converted when Marx was a kid. And then Marx at 19 famously claims he takes up with Satan. And that seems like, angsty teenager, mad at dad's a Lutheran, and then he's got all this Christian heresy that he's importing from Hegel and the other German idealists to build out this weird architecture that he's built out. So there was definitely something going on in Germany at the time, which was this kind of weird current in high society of mysticism and lots of secret societies trafficking in that mysticism.
Nothing disqualifies Marx quite like his poetry, his satanic poetry. So just a couple of questions. We'll have some fun with these on the criticisms that you've gotten since the article was published. Jim Hansen posted a side-by-side, which you did as well, actually, on your website, and Mike Cernovich responded, James significantly rewrote the original passages while claiming he submitted them materially unaltered, incredibly dishonest representation of what he did. Tim Poole said, James Lindsay is the woke right, the right hand of the left. He accused you of peddling smarmy and dishonest takes in an attempt to adhere to some kind of social orthodoxy, along with the rest of former liberal cohort, who desperately desire not to be called conservative. So I guess there are two criticisms there. One is that you altered this beyond its ability to sort of function as a representation of new right thought. And then the second is that you're sort of performatively lashing out at the right so that people don't lump you in with the icky right. Is there any truth to either of them?
No. So as it turns out, Jim Hansen did and I know Jim, which is kind of weird that this happened, but he did this sort of very naive, I call it functionally illiterate. It's like he literally put the texts into Microsoft Word and saw what percentage of the words are identically the same in the same positions. That means that the sentences don't actually carry meaning. So for example, in the very first sentence of the essay that I submitted, I said, a spirit is haunting America, the spirit of the new Christian right. And the famous opening line of the Communist Manifesto is, a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. So spirit and specter are not the same word. And obviously new Christian right is not the same word as communism. And so that counts as like a ding against me there. But the best refutation of Jim Hansen's point is not to go into this textual analysis and all this comparison. Somebody made a comparison of the first couple pages. It'd be nice to go through the whole thing and highlight section by section where everything lines up. The best refutation is that this article got published on American Reformer on the 18th of November. I didn't find out till the 28th of November, rather hilariously, but it got published on the 18th of November. In the comments left on the article on the 18th of November one of the commenters said this is pulled directly from the Communist Manifesto and put some of the passages in there. And you can still see the article, the comment. The comment's still on the article. The date is still on the comment. It was immediately recognized by everyday readers of the American Reformer that this was a knockoff of the Communist Manifesto. You can also feed it into your favorite AI and see does this article plagiarize the Communist Manifesto, and see what it says. Specifically ask if it plagiarized. It says yes. That's a superficial point. I mean, like I said, it's functionally illiterate. It's like functional illiteracy means I can take the words on the sheet, read them to you, pronounce all the words correctly, more or less, and you think I can read, but I don't know what any of it means. So it's a functionally illiterate critique, unfortunately, that he put. I don't know why he felt the need to put out something that amateur. Now, this idea that I'm trying to get away from the right is kind of ridiculous. I do most of my work with conservative groups. I have started to tentatively identify myself vaguely as conservative, or at least am much more open to that than I would have been before. I don't have any beef. I think Tim Pool, speaking of, since he's the character involved, I think he just did that on his show. And I don't follow his show anymore, but I heard that he just did this with somebody on his show, like trying to scramble away from the accusation that he's a conservative. So it's weirdly projection. But no, I'm not interested in separating myself or from conservatives. I'm not interested in distinguishing myself from conservatives or Christians. I'm interested in distinguishing myself from fascists. And that's a very different thing. And what if you actually read subtly on the article that I wrote, I do not accuse, I'm also being accused, by the way, of saying that the American Reformer guys are communists. I specifically in my write-up did not say that they're communists. I said that they're making the same exact mistake as the fascists.
Now, that actually, because Cernovich and you essentially agree, which is funny, that there's the new right sees utility in the critical theorists who were drawing on Marx and in Marx himself, as the American Reformer itself conceded. So I guess that brings me to my last question, James, which is, do you worry? I mean, Chris Rufo just published a blueprint for disentangling wokeness from the bureaucracy, but there are people sort of who will be stepping into these roles, who will be stepping into the federal government, into the bureaucracy, and taking with them some new right ideas that you argue will carry woke right baggage with them into the administration. So as somebody who's been sort of at the forefront of this ideological argument against the entrenched wokeness, are you concerned about how that battle might be waged in a second Trump administration?
Yeah, and so a lot of people got really mad at me. They're like, James, don't start, because I started before the election. I started going after exposing the woke right before the election. And just to be clear, I identified the woke right problem for the first time in January of 2021. So it's not like it just popped out of the ground. I've been tracking this for a long time, just like I tracked the woke left for a long time before it became on the public radar. So I've been aware of this and these developments and their philosophers and what they say, and there's podcasts and on Twitter for a long time. I was going to hold off until the election. I was like, we got to win this election. Everything's on the line. We cannot, I actually don't think the country would have survived intact a Kamala Harris presidency. And so we've got to win this election. So don't start this strife before the election. And then I started to see the moves that were being made and the plays that were being made by a lot of these characters online who were in, if Trump wins, it looks like they were trying to position themselves to ride that momentum and take positions of power. Then if Trump loses, it looks like they were trying to position themselves to be able to rouse the masses into some kind of rash reaction to the election. And I thought, I have to speak up now. And primarily, if Trump wins, we have to have this discussion already on the table before 1,000 of these people get stuck in the federal bureaucracy for maybe up to 4 years or longer. And so I thought, I'm going to take the bullet. I'm going to go ahead and say something about this. I got a lot of static for it. People were very upset that I did it before the election, starting about 6 weeks out from the election. I've paid a heavy price for that. And I continued. And then this hoax, of course, comes luckily at the beginning of December before, we've got almost 2 months before the power apparatus switches over. And I'm hoping that actually the result is going to be that this is going to stymie their bids for power, which I believe that they'll abuse if they get it, and that we have greater discernment in this crucial time, because I think America basically dodged a bullet, kind of literally dodged a bullet. And by by doing so, we're given almost like this second chance to not end up in some kind of a totalitarian or authoritarian hellhole. And here we are at this crucial moment in time, and I see the wedge element trying to stake its claim on power, and I figured I just had to do what I could to box it out. I think that the conflict in the administration will hopefully be less because of these efforts than it would have been, because these are divisive wedge elements. They create a situation where they get into a position or into an organization or into a department, and then they create us versus them narratives. You're either 100% a pro-America patriot, or you're some kind of a libtard cuck or something like that. And there's no in-betweens, and it's too ridiculous. This is called an affordance trap in political warfare. And they create these very polarizing situations where everybody either comes with them or they're the worst kind of worst person ever. And I want to minimize that inside the administration, because I saw what that did when feminism did it to everything else 10 years ago. I would love to not see that from these chest-pounding wannabe theocrats or neo-fascists.
Libtard cuck James Lindsay, thank you so much for being here. I'm kidding. It's a good phrase, but thank you,
I'm
James.
getting called worse.
You should, I'm sure you are. But thank you. I really appreciate you fleshing some of this out. It was super interesting. So have a great afternoon.
Yeah, thanks.
You can maybe tell that I myself am sort of two minds about all of this. I'm a Christian, so the Manichaean worldview is obviously something that's important to me about good and evil. At the same time, there's use of that in a micro sense and in a macro sense that I think really matters in this context. And I've written many times about not throwing the sort of bathwater, the baby of classical liberalism, out with the bathwater that a lot of people on the new right, and J.D. Vance is one of those people, are identifying right now. They're being really, really smart at sometimes looking at the bathwater and saying, why have we been ignoring this? This is itself contaminated. This itself is full of ideological bacteria, because if you look at, small towns that have been hollowed out by NAFTA or by this sort of post-war liberal consensus in a way that contrasts with different ideas before the Second World War, you see something just different. So all that is to say, I think James's operation here was really provocative and helpfully so, even if, maybe I'm still thinking through myself some of what it means to reconsider that micro-Manichaean political dichotomy and think about whether it applies, James's criticism applies on the macro level. It's just sort of from a faith perspective. These are conversations well worth having, and I do, for what it's worth, think he is right about some of these litmus tests right now being beaverish here in DC, and that's happening. That's as Donald Trump prepares to stock the bureaucracy after potential purges, and with people who are first and foremost loyal to the ideology of Trumpism, for better or worse. That's going to matter. I mean, these sort of ideological currents, or maybe I should say undercurrents, really do matter. So thank you for tuning in. I hope you found that conversation as interesting as I did. We hope to continue hosting conversations like these, debates like these, and it's, I don't know, I really enjoy it. I think it's useful, even as a lot of people like to yell and scream and do all of that. I think it's fun to just have the conversation. So make sure to subscribe here to Undercurrents. We are here with a new show every weekday, Monday through Friday. Subscribe wherever you download audio versions of your podcasts. And of course, over at undercurrents.tv for full premium episodes at least once a week, and the full premium experience of the show. That means you get stuff from Unheard, the website, some fantastic content as well. If you subscribe, it's $1 for your first month at undercurrents.tv. We'll be back here with more soon.